Hello, my compadres. Hope everyone's doing all right. Thank you for joining me for this brief foray into the underpinnings of Homer's The Odyssey. I want to talk about just a couple of things today, and I'll try to do it without belaboring too much, but I hope that this is helpful. I hope it helps you understand the Odyssey a little better. What I want to address today are a couple of things. The structure of the Odyssey, how it's shaped, how it's put together, and then the epic conventions that we find, the elements of an epic that we find in the Odyssey. Okay, so first let's talk about the structure of the Odyssey. When we talk about structure, what we're talking about is how a work is organized, how it's shaped. It's not just how one thing happens and the next thing happens, in a plot line like that. That's part of it. And plot is often used as the structuring device for a narrative. But it's also larger than that. It's also bigger than that. Structure is how not just we have the overall shape of a particular narrative, but we also have the smaller incidents or the smaller units that take place within the narrative, how they're arranged and how they're connected to themselves and to that overarching pattern, that overarching structure. So structure is a major element. It's primarily linked to plot, but it doesn't always have to be. I've read many narratives that, structurally speaking, have hardly any plot necessarily in terms of a traditional plot, but they're structured according to symbolism or a particular image or a particular metaphor. So a lot of things add to a structure. Setting can add to a structure, etc. But I hope you get the idea that when we're talking about structure, we're talking about how the entire narrative is organized and shaped both broadly and in detail. Okay, specifically. Okay, broadly and specifically. So, with the Odyssey, we know that first off, we have 24 books. Okay, we had those 24 rolls of papyrus back in between the 6th and 7th century BCE in Greece. Okay. Now, like I mentioned before, those 24 scrolls basically are 24 books. So when we look at the Odyssey, that's our first level of structure. We have these 24 books. Okay. Now, these 24 books are essentially cut in half. We have the first half of the Odyssey, and then we have the second half of the Odyssey. So the first half is a structural element, and the second half is a structural element. So the first half is comprised of the first 7 books. Books 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and 7. The second half is comprised of books 8 to 24. Okay, so we have this distinction. That we have 2 separate chunks, you might say. We have these 2 halves. The first half isn't as long or as large as the second half, but the first half is necessary and impacts the second half. So let's focus on the first half, books 1 through 7, for a moment. Okay. within this particular structure, within the first half of the books, we can then break those down into a second layer, or really a third layer of structure. The first 4 books, books 1 through 4, basically set the scene in Ithaca of the Odyssey. The main figure in these first 4 books is Telemachus, Odysseus' son. He's searching for news of his father. His father has not been heard from since he left to fight in the Trojan War nearly 20 years earlier. Okay. So Telemachus in these first 4 books goes in search of 2 people, 2 men who fought with his father in Troy, Nestor and Menelaus, or Menelaus, basically. Menelaus, people call it different things, but Nestor and Menelaus. And from them, he discovers that his father is still alive. Okay, so that's what happens in those first 4 books. Okay, we're still in the first half of the Odyssey. So the second 4 books, books 5 through 8, now turn their attention to introducing the character, the figure of Odysseus. He's our protagonist. He's our hero. He's our central character for the Odyssey. And so when we first meet him, he's essentially being released from captivity by the nymph Calypso on her island. The island is called Ogygia. Okay. Anyway, she has kept him and his men as prisoners on this island, and he talks her into letting them go. Okay. So the nymph Calypso says, "Okay, Odysseus, I'll let you go." And then he and his crew leave in their ship, and they experience a shipwreck. And they land on the shore of Sharia, or Sharia, however you'd like to pronounce it. This is the land of the Phaeacians. Okay. So when we get to there, that's the first half of the Odyssey. Okay, we've met Telemachus, we know the basic situation. We've met Odysseus and his crew, and we're following them now. Okay. Then the second half begins with book 8. Okay. In book 8 on up to about book 12. Okay. You could say 9 to 12, but really with it really starts with 8. Here we have in these 3 to 4 books, Odysseus telling his story to the Phaeacians. Okay, he talks about his journey thus far, how he went to war in the Trojan War, how he left, what's happened to him and his crew, how he left the island of Calypso, etc. So, and he's telling them that he's trying to get back home. He wants to return to his kingdom of Ithaca. Okay, so we have those first handfuls of books. Again, basically books 9 to 12. Book 8 is kind of that in between that links the 2 halves together. Okay, in books 13 to 24, the next 11 books, this is really the full-blown second half of the story. Okay. Technically it starts in book 8, but as far as action goes, things that occur, that really starts in book 13. Okay. So in this second half of the poem, Odysseus is back in Ithaca. He's faced unexpected obstacles. He's gone through danger, and he's had adventure after adventure. But now he's back in Ithaca. Okay. Now he has to, since he's in Ithaca, he has one final hurdle that he has to overcome. Okay. His absence has led to his wife, Penelope, being courted by a large number of suitors. Okay. In fact, more than 100 suitors are now, courting Penelope and seeking her hand in marriage in Ithaca. Okay. And they stay in Odysseus. They've been staying, I should say. They've been staying in Odysseus's house. They've been eating his food, drinking his wine, carousing, while Penelope, quite wisely, has put off any kind of decision because she wants her husband back, obviously. She doesn't want to give up hope that he's still alive. And so Odysseus, in the second half of the poem, has to go in and after going through all these different adventures, like the Cyclops and the Sirens, etc., and etc., he now has to go in incognito, in disguise, to wrest his kingdom from these suitors. Okay, and he first has to, make contact with Telemachus, and then they and some helpers go to his castle, and eventually Odysseus kills all of the suitors. His helpers are, like I said, Telemachus, but also Eumaeus, who's a servant, and another servant, Philolaetius. So these four have to work their way back into the palace and wage battle and undergo adventures, just on this part, getting rid of Penelope's suitors. Okay. So that's the basic structure of the Odyssey. Okay. A lot of good stuff, a lot of really awesome scenes and characters, but this is how it's shaped, and this is how we have the large pattern, but we also have the more specific events that take place. Now let's turn our attention to the conventions of the epic that we find in the Odyssey. Homer, quote unquote, established some very specific literary practices or rules and devices that eventually became commonplace in epic poetry. But when the Iliad and the Odyssey were first being developed, and through the years of oral tradition and their transmission to a written form, these conventions, these rules, these characteristics of the epic have now been fully developed. So here are just some very basic epic conventions that we find in the Odyssey. First, we have an invocation. This is at the very beginning. This is where we have a muse who is invoking the gods. and sort of imploring the gods and the reader to listen and to pay attention to this tale. Okay. Then we have the beginning of the main story, in the middle, really, of the hero's adventures. We call this by a Latin name, in medias res. It begins starting in the middle of things. Okay. A lot of things have happened before we start, and so those things are either summarized or alluded to or remembered, but we start in the middle of things. And so the Odyssey essentially starts in ultimately the last few months of Odysseus's adventures. But we find out what's happened during those previous 10 years. Okay. A third element of the epic is it tells a story that readers or the audience already knows, or at least is already familiar with. So it's not anything brand new. They've heard this before, it's just being told in a new, different way. An epic also has the conventions of conflict, especially in the celestial realm, in the spiritual world, or the realm of the gods, and definitely we have that. And I'll talk about the Greek gods and goddesses here in a minute. And then we have the use of epithets. Okay. Remember that an epithet is a description that Homer uses. It's basically a combination of a very descriptive phrase coupled with a specific noun. So what we get with an epithet is a miniature portrait that we're able to identify a person or a thing because it's being highlighted as a prominent or important characteristic of that person or that thing. So invocation, in medias res, familiarity with the story, celestial conflict, and epithets are just some, not all, but some of the more significant conventions of the epic that we find in the Odyssey. Now, infuse all that with the influence of Greek mythology. Okay, we have the structure, we have the epic conventions, and in the midst, connecting all of that and seeping through the story, we have Greek mythology, Greek gods and goddesses. We have one of the most important Greek writers, or probably the most important Greek writer next to Homer, Hesiod, who was born in the 7th or 8th century BCE. And we basically determined that Homer was born in the 8th or 9th century BCE. And again, those dates are always a bit flexible, a bit fluid. But Hesiod and Homer immortalized Greek mythology. They're the two sources that we really look to in terms of studying and understanding the mythology of ancient Greece. Hesiod did it in his work, The Theogony. And Homer, of course, did the same thing in the Iliad and now the Odyssey. So through both of these works, the Iliad and the Odyssey, a primary element is the element of Greek mythology. I'm not going to go into every little bitty detail of it, but essentially we have 12 Greek gods of Mount Olympus. Mount Olympus is the highest mountain in Greece. It's symbolic of heaven. It's where the gods reside. Okay. The 12 gods are everlasting, they're eternal. But one of the things that really marks Greek mythology and the Greek gods is they are very much like humans. They show very human-like behavior. Okay, at times they can be loving, but they can also be dangerous and petty. They could be generous, but they could also be very stingy and very selfish. They can be wise, and sometimes they can just be flat out stupid. So, but there's still a higher level of being than mere humans. But this says a great deal, I think, about the Greek belief system, that there is a separation between the divine, as personified by the Greek gods and goddesses, and the mortal, or the human. For the Greeks, the way that they could understand and relate to this concept of the divine is by seeing exaggerated versions of themselves, okay, complete with their own foibles and their own weaknesses and their own greater characteristics. Okay, one of the great things about Greek gods and goddesses is, yes, they can be loving, but they can be extremely quick to anger at the drop of a hat. And they can be vengeful, and they can punish humans, and there's always duplicity and deception going on throughout Mount Olympus. We have the king of the gods, Zeus, and his queen Hera, but Zeus is constantly descending to earth and committing adultery and impregnating various nymphs, and giving, making various demigods like Theseus and Hercules or Heracles. We have the Greek god of war in Ares, who is in love with Aphrodite, the goddess of love. We have the goddess of Athena, who springs full blown from the skull of Zeus. We have Hera, who is constantly jealous of every single female that Zeus has laid claim to, and seeks vengeance on these women, as well as heroes. But the gods, in various ways, are there to help the heroes. They're bound by fate, but they can't change fate. And this becomes one of the major themes. Mentioned it with the Iliad, but we're really going to talk about it here with the Odyssey. So, you've got the structure, you've got the epic conventions, and you have the influence of the Greek mythological system, all at play in the Odyssey. Hope that's understandable. If you have questions, you can always contact me. Thank you for listening, and we'll see you next time.